The biblical figure of Joshua and the conquest of the walls of Jericho is one of the most iconic and fascinating episodes narrated in the Bible. After the death of Moses, Joshua is chosen by God to lead the people of Israel in the conquest of the Promised Land. With the mission of taking possession of the city of Jericho, Joshua and his men face an apparently impossible challenge. The imposing walls that surrounded the city seemed impenetrable. However, God reveals to Joshua a divine plan for the conquest of Jericho. Instructed to order the Israelites to march around the city walls for 7 days, Joshua faithfully obeys, even in the face of the apparent madness of this strategy. As the Israelites follow God's orders, a miraculous event occurs. On the 7th day, after the sound of the trumpets, the mighty walls of Jericho collapse, paving the way for the Israelites' victory. The conquest of Jericho is an episode full of symbolic and spiritual significance. More than a simple military battle, this story represents the unwavering faith of Joshua and his people in divine providence. By following God's instructions, even in the face of an apparently impossible challenge, the Israelites demonstrated their trust in the omnipotence of the Lord and their willingness to obey His will. This episode also symbolizes the importance of obedience and perseverance in the journey of faith. Despite doubts and the apparent madness of the divine strategy, Joshua and his people remained steadfast, trusting that God would guide them to victory. The fall of the walls of Jericho represents, therefore, the overcoming of seemingly insurmountable obstacles by the grace and power of God. To this day, the story of Joshua and the conquest of Jericho continues to inspire the faithful, reminding us of the importance of faith, obedience, and trust in God, even in the face of the greatest challenges. This biblical narrative reminds us that, with divine help, we can overcome any obstacle that presents itself in our journey of faith. The episode of the conquest of Jericho not only symbolizes the military victory of the Israelites, but also carries profound theological and spiritual meanings. The city of Jericho, with its imposing walls, represented a formidable obstacle not only for Joshua's armies, but also for the realization of God's plan to establish His people in the Promised Land. By ordering the Israelites to march around the walls and make them collapse with the sound of the trumpets, God was demonstrating His sovereignty and power over all the forces of the world. The fall of the walls of Jericho represented the victory of God over human power, reaffirming His authority and His ability to fulfill His purposes, even in the face of what seems impossible. In addition, the conquest of Jericho also symbolizes the importance of obedience and faith in God's plan. By faithfully following the divine instructions, even when they seemed absurd from a human perspective, Joshua and his people demonstrated their unwavering trust in the leadership and wisdom of God. This obedience was crucial for the victory to be achieved, as it was what opened the way for the miraculous intervention of the Lord. The story of Joshua and Jericho reminds us that, no matter how difficult the challenges we face, obedience and faith in God can lead us to victory. When we trust in His guidance and His will, even if we cannot fully understand it, God is capable of performing extraordinary feats in our lives. Another important aspect of the conquest of Jericho is its relationship to the theme of divine justice. The city of Jericho was seen as a center of idolatry and immorality, representing a threat to the spiritual purity of the people of Israel. Its destruction, therefore, can be interpreted as an act of divine judgment on the sin and corruption that prevailed in that society. By ordering the complete destruction of Jericho, God was demonstrating His holiness and His determination to purify the Promised Land of all evil influences. This divine action also served as a warning to the people of Israel about the importance of remaining faithful to God and avoiding the temptations of the world. In addition to the spiritual and theological significance, the story of the conquest of Jericho also carries important lessons about the nature of leadership and military strategy. Joshua, as the leader chosen by God, demonstrated a remarkable ability to inspire and mobilize his people, even in the face of an apparently impossible challenge. His obedience to divine instructions, his patience in following God's plan, and his ability to coordinate the actions of his army were crucial to the victory. This narrative teaches us that, as leaders, we must be willing to follow God's guidance, even when his ways seem to go against human logic. It is in this trust and obedience that we find the strength to overcome the greatest obstacles. Another fascinating aspect of the story of Joshua and Jericho is the way it connects with the theme of the conquest of the Promised Land. Jericho was the first city to be conquered by the Israelites after crossing the Jordan River, representing the definitive entry of God's people into the land that had been promised to them for generations. The fall of the walls of Jericho symbolized, therefore, the fulfillment of God's promises and the beginning of the realization of his plan to establish Israel as a sovereign nation in the region. This initial victory would serve as inspiration and encouragement for the next battles the Israelites would face in the conquest of the Promised Land. In addition to the historical and spiritual significance, the story of Joshua and Jericho has also been the subject of intense research and debate among scholars and archaeologists. Over the years, various efforts have been made to try to locate and identify the archaeological remains of the ancient city of Jericho, seeking evidence to corroborate the biblical narrative. Although there is some controversy and uncertainty surrounding the archaeological discoveries, many scholars believe that there are significant indications that support the veracity of the events narrated in the Bible. This continuous search for historical evidence demonstrates the fascination and importance that the story of Joshua and Jericho maintains for the understanding of the past and the Judeo-Christian tradition. Over the centuries, the story of Joshua and the conquest of Jericho has inspired artists, writers, and thinkers to explore its symbolic and spiritual meanings. From representations in works of art to literary and cinematic adaptations, this biblical narrative continues to capture the imagination and evoke profound reflections on themes such as faith, leadership, divine justice, and the fulfillment of God's purposes. This longevity and relevance of the story of Joshua and Jericho demonstrate its importance as one of the most iconic and influential episodes of the Judeo-Christian tradition. By revisiting this narrative, we are reminded of the importance of trusting in God, obeying His will, and persevering in the face of the greatest challenges, for it is in this journey of faith that God fulfills His miraculous plans. Throughout history, the conquest of Jericho by Joshua has been interpreted in various ways, reflecting the richness and complexity of this biblical narrative. Some scholars view it as a literal historical event, while others interpret it more symbolically as a representation of the spiritual struggle of God's people against evil and temptation. Regardless of the approach adopted, the story of Joshua and Jericho continues to inspire and challenge readers to reflect on the nature of faith, the importance of obedience to God, and the power of divine intervention in human life. This narrative reminds us that, even in the face of the greatest obstacles, trust in God and the willingness to follow His will can lead us to victory. As we delve into this fascinating story, we are invited to examine our own journey of faith, seeking inspiration and strength to face the challenges that arise in our lives. For just as Joshua and his people, we too are called to trust in God's plan, even when His ways seem to go against human logic.